Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder. And last time I wrapped up Joseph Hooker's biography, and I'm ready to dive into the next choice by the Patreon members, William Hardee. If you'd like to vote on which general I cover next, join the Patreon page for as little as $1 and you can cast your ballot. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, or purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. It was September 1864, and Lieutenant General William J. Hardee met with Confederate President Jefferson Davis at Palmetto Station, Georgia. The Army of Tennessee, the army he had fought with most of the war, had just been forced out of Atlanta, and now Union General William T. Sherman controlled the vital southern city. Hardee wanted transferred. He could no longer serve under General John Bell Hood, the commander of the Army of Tennessee. Davis had no problem sending him away, giving him command of the Department of South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. As Hardee left the Army, he did so with a heavy heart. He loved the Army of Tennessee, but he couldn't remain with it. West Point trained commanders, as well as rank and file of both armies, were greatly impacted by Hardee. He literally wrote the book on light infantry tactics that Civil War armies used to train their soldiers. In that way, he may be one of the most influential generals of the war, but time doesn't remember him as well as men like Thomas Stonewall Jackson, William T. Sherman, Robert E. Lee, or Ulysses S. Grant. The failures of the Army of Tennessee led many Southerners to take focus away from the Western theater when writing about the war and focus on the Eastern theater and the Army of Northern Virginia with its lauded commander Robert E. Lee. Thus, one of the highest-ranking generals in the West, Hardee, gets left out of the discussion of Civil War generals. Hardee was born in Camden County, Georgia, on the land rewarded to his grandfather, Captain Joseph John Hardee, by the state of Georgia for his service during the American Revolutionary War. Captain Hardee was from Pitt County, North Carolina, but received a commission in the Georgia military, where he outfitted his own ship, a galley named the Washington, along with the slaves to help operate it. During the war, he harassed British ships around Savannah, Georgia. In 1778, he and a squadron of galleys attacked and captured 2 British brigs and a sloop. He was awarded 1,360 acres on the Little Satilla Neck that he turned into a cotton plantation that he called Rural Felicity. Captain Hardee died at Rural Felicity in 1809. His son John Hardee followed in his father's footsteps, becoming a prominent citizen in the county, becoming a major in the Georgia militia, and expanding the operations at Rural Felicity by increasing his number of slaves. John married Sarah Ellis of Savannah, Georgia in 1797. On October 12, 1815, they welcomed into the world their 7th child, named William Joseph Hardee. No schools were available in the area for William Hardee to attend, but the family was wealthy enough to acquire tutors for their children, and by all accounts they were excellent teachers. A local attorney examined young Hardee and declared, "I have no hesitation in saying that I find him much farther advanced than could have been expected in any young man of his age. He also acquired the art of stenography after Gould's most approved system, has some knowledge of the Latin language, and has made considerable progress in that of French, the study of which, with that of the higher branches of English education, he is now pursuing." All this education prepared Hardee for his dream career, the military. In 1830, he and his father approached their congressional representative to lobby on behalf of William Hardee's appointment to the United States Military Academy at West Point. Young Hardee even wrote a letter to the Secretary of War expressing his most earnest wish of being a cadet. Despite their efforts, there were no spaces available and none in the near future. Distraught but not giving up, Hardee joined his older brother Noble Hardee on his cotton plantation and learned the skills of a cotton factor, buying and selling cotton as the market ebbed and flowed. In March 1833, he found that some vacancies had opened up at West Point, and he wrote personally to the Secretary of War about gaining one of those positions. Apparently the response was either negative or evasive because he wasn't accepted. So Hardee traveled to Milledgeville, Georgia, to the governor and pleaded his case. The governor was impressed by the determination and endorsed a letter to the Secretary of War, but Hardee didn't stop there. He got his congressman to again recommend him. On March 15, 1834, Hardee received his appointment to West Point. In that year, he became a cadet, entering the academy and taking the entrance exam. That first year, Hardee stood in the middle of the road academically within his class of 57, but in conduct, He did extremely well, standing at 69th out of 240 cadets in conduct, only earning 35 demerits his first year. He became a cadet corporal, given more responsibilities because of his dependability, but his standing in both conduct and academically both fell, getting 87 demerits and performing poorly in mathematics, dropping his overall standing to 150th out of 216 cadets. It doesn't appear that Hardee read much beyond the required reading for his studies. The limited books he checked out were about American history, but he also checked out a 3-volume set of The History of Scotland by William Robertson. Hardee continued to suffer academically while at West Point, but despite those deficiencies, he was appointed a lieutenant in his last year at the academy, and given the supervision of a barracks wing. However, 5 days after his appointment to that rank, he was arrested for leaving his post as officer of the day without proper authorization, but as one of his biographers explains, he received the light penalty of 1 additional tour of duty, and still retained his position. The light penalty indicates perhaps that Hardee's infraction resulted not from a flagrant violation of orders, but from his inexperience in his new role as officer of the day. Hardee graduated in the class of 1838, ranking 26th out of a class of 45, a class that included future Civil War notables like Edward Allegheny Johnson, Andrew Jackson Smith, Pierre-Gustave Toutant-Beauregard, Henry Sibley, and Carter L. Stevenson. As one of his biographers expressed, it should be pointed out that his academic record was mediocre at best. Hardee salvaged his performance at the military academy by determined and evidently enthusiastic self-application in the military courses. His record of promotions in the cadet corps indicates that he at least succeeded in winning the confidence of his classmates and superiors. Hardee, on leave, returned to rural Felicity to spend time with his family, but he would soon have to join his unit, the 2nd Dragoons, in Florida. But before he could travel to Florida, word came to him to report to General Winfield Scott in northern Georgia. Scott was organizing the removal of the Cherokee out of their homes in northern Georgia, southeastern Tennessee, and northern Alabama, and Hardee helped with finding those who resisted removal west of the Mississippi River. After a few months, Scott moved forward with what would become the Trail of Tears, but Hardee wouldn't be with them. Hardee was to report to his unit in Florida. On November 21, 1838, he was so ill he was admitted to the government hospital in St. Augustine, Florida, where he remained until December 4th. When he returned to his command, he was in Company B of the 2nd Dragoons. Although military expeditions were expected in Florida to operate against the Seminoles, who were also contested being moved west of the Mississippi River, Hardee spent a great deal of his time with his command building roads and constructing bridges and causeways. However, when the commander in Florida received word of a hostile group of Seminoles camped in a nearby swamp, Hardee's regiment investigated. They slashed through the dense swamp and finally found the camp, but after the soldiers fired one volley, the Seminoles ran. Support for the war waned in Congress as it required more and more funds to support the army there and to grow the army to combat the Seminoles. General Alexander Macomb was granted permission and power to bring about a peace treaty with the Seminoles. After some contested negotiations, a peace treaty was laid out and signed in April 1839. Many soldiers, including 6 companies of the 2nd Dragoons, left Florida after the treaty was signed, but Company B remained. In July, Hardee received a leave of absence to go visit family in Camden County, but while there, a horrible tragedy occurred. His older brother, Thomas, was murdered on the streets of St. Mary's, Georgia. While he was home, the peace ushered in by General Macomb ended, with attacks by the Seminoles increasing all over Florida. The call went out for volunteers to come fight them, and Hardee returned to Florida to train the new recruits. Hardee mostly performed paperwork as the acting assistant commissary and subsistence officer and acting assistant quartermaster. He finally returned to his command at Fort Fulton near St. Augustine, and in 1840 he was promoted to first lieutenant. However, from June to October, Hardee was placed on sick leave, and he spent most of his time at the government hospital in St. Augustine. However, he didn't spend all of his time in the hospital. He found opportunities to make frequent trips to see the Dummett family at their plantation outside the city, or visit their home on the corner of St. George and St. Francis streets. There he met the Dummett's 20-year-old daughter, Elizabeth. The courting of Elizabeth started while he was on sick leave, but a week after he returned to the service with his company, his superiors notified him that he was to leave for France and study for a year at the Royal Cavalry School. Later in life, Hardee would tell his children that, He could not leave his beautiful sweetheart until she became his wife. Hardee quickly proposed, and they were married a few days later on November 16, 1840. A family saying came out of the rapid wedding. Grandfather had to leave for France before the wedding cake was cool enough to cut. The Secretary of War most likely chose Hardee and two others to attend the school for two reasons. The Secretary had observed the French cavalry during the close of the Napoleonic Wars and wanted to bring the American cavalry up to the European standards. Another reason is because a recent inspection of the dragoons illustrated a poor state of instruction on the part of the officers. Joel Poinsett, the Secretary of War, met with Hardee and the other two men, Washington Irving Newton and Lloyd J. Beale, gave them their instructions, and filled their pockets with 4 months' advance pay. The three soldiers sailed from New York destined for France. The cavalry school was founded by King Louis XV in 1768 and designed for two reasons: as a postgraduate study by those entering the mounted arm of the military, and by cavalry officers who were returning to France from various campaigns to freshen up their formal knowledge of improved cavalry tactics. One of Hardee's biographers couldn't brag enough about how this school influenced Hardee. The year spent in France had a significant impact on Lieutenant Hardee. It broadened his military perspective. It taught him by association the refinement that comes from being a member of a capable, confident, and institutionalized class of military devotees. It showed him the weaknesses inherent in a rough, semi-trained, semi-disciplined citizen army such as the United States possessed in the early 19th century, and it demonstrated clearly the wonders that could be wrought through intensive military instruction, rigorous discipline, and a professional attitude toward military affairs. Above all, it taught Hardee what a model Army officer could be and should be. Hardee completed his studies in January 1842 and returned to the United States after spending a few weeks in England. He found that his regiment had moved from Florida to Louisiana, so Hardee requested that he be allowed to go to Florida to bring his wife from St. Augustine to Baton Rouge, Louisiana. It was granted, and the two settled in their new home. They found Baton Rouge a miserable place to live. The town was filled with ne'er-do-wells, and dirt streets would suffocate those who walked or rode on them. When it rained, the quagmire produced by the precipitation threatened to remove the shoes of those who dared to walk in the streets. They wouldn't stay there long, though. By May 1843, Hardee and his wife moved to Fort Jessup in northwest Louisiana. Superiors ordered Hardee to begin an extensive training program based on his recent schooling for the dragoons. Hardee conducted a strict program, training the men with sabers and lances and putting them on par with their European counterparts. Because of his ability, Hardee was promoted to captain on October 21, 1844, and given command of Company C of the 2nd Dragoons. Also at Fort Jessup, Hardee's first two children were born, Anna in 1843 and Sarah in 1845. As Hardee drilled his dragoons, relations between Mexico and the United States were breaking down. When Texas agreed to its annexation, the U.S. government sent General Zachary Taylor to the Texas-Mexico border. Most of his troops traveled by ship from New Orleans to Corpus Christi, Texas, but the dragoons traveled overland, arriving at Taylor's camp on the Rio Grande, opposite the Mexican town of Matamoros. On April 24, 1846, a squadron of dragoons, with Hardee as second in command, left Taylor's army on a reconnoitering journey of about 22 miles to investigate river crossings. At a ranch, Captain Seth Thornton stopped the squadron and, instead of posting sentries, allowed his men to scatter about the ranch, looking in the Mexican dwellings, and some even fell asleep. A Mexican force surprised the Americans and dispersed them in wild confusion. Thornton attempted to launch a counterstrike, but was unable to do so. Hardee found 25 members of Company C and was going to escape across the river, but the banks were too steep, so he formed up a little battle line to fight it out. His men informed him that many of them had lost their weapons in the confusion and couldn't combat the Mexicans. Unable to resist, Hardee sent over a flag of truce to the Mexican commander, asking for honorable terms, but if not, he proposed to charge them and to sell their lives as dearly as possible. The Mexican commander agreed to the honorable terms, and Hardee surrendered his part of the squadron. Hardee was held captive in Matamoros, in the dwelling of General Arista, having Hardee dine at his table and lodge in his own home. Hardee got along well and enjoyed himself while a prisoner. By May 10, 1846, Taylor won 2 victories, one at Palo Alto and the other at Resaca de la Palma. After those victories, Taylor possessed enough prisoners to exchange for his own. which he did with Hardee returning to his command by May 11th. Hardee returned to the army with much less warmth from his comrades than he expected. While a captive, he sent his report in to Taylor about the ambush. In it, he points to Thornton's lack of alertness and control that led to the capture of the squadron. Thornton also filed a report after his capture, stating that all the precautions were taken to avoid an ambush, but his guide was untrustworthy. He went further and criticized Taylor, stating that the commanding general gave him an impossible task within the requisite amount of time. Hardee received harsh looks and snide remarks, as many agree with Thornton's report and saw Hardee's as an attack on his commander. So, Hardee asked for an investigation of the ambush, because imputations of an unworthy and injurious nature have been by some individual at least been made with more or less publicity against me, and parts of my official report have been said to contradict that of Captain Thornton, my commanding officer. The court of inquiry began, and Hardee represented himself, calling witnesses and getting at the truth of the ambush. During the trial, witness after witness sided with Hardee and against Thornton. Lieutenant Kane stated that Hardee appeared to be cool and collected and not at all excited, and that Hardee wanted to fight, but the men did not possess sufficient arms or will. A trooper from Company F maintained that, by trying to collect the men in going to the river and in surrendering, I thought he saved our lives. He was cool and his conduct was good. He wanted us to fight. Another Company F sergeant said, I thought Captain Hardee behaved like a courageous man, and if we had followed his advice, we would have been better off. The court found Hardee's report correct, but he still possessed a blemish on his record, being a part of the ones captured in the ambush, and some still disliked Hardee for his report against Thornton. Hardee sought to reclaim his reputation in the upcoming campaigns. However, what became known as the Thornton Affair had larger repercussions than just a court of inquiry. President James K. Polk used the deaths of the capture of those American soldiers to ask Congress for a declaration of war, which he received on May 13, 1846. During the summer and into the fall of 1846, Hardee suffered from the illness he contracted in Florida, most likely dysentery, that put him in the Army hospital for multiple days, but when he found out that his command was to advance on Monterrey, Mexico, he left his sickbed early to take the field with the dragoons. Hardee helped clear pockets of resistance and protected the pioneer crews, who repaired roads and infrastructure as the American Army pushed into the Mexican territory. The Army advanced on Saltillo, and while there enjoyed some relaxation. Hardee and some of the others went sightseeing and attempted to get to know some of the locals, but as Lieutenant Daniel Harvey Hill explained, we had a most laughable time of it and were completely unsuccessful. The main theater of operations was about to change, with General Winfield Scott preparing to invade Mexico and capture its capital after entering the country at Veracruz. The 2nd Dragoons were ordered to join Scott. They got on transports, but a horrible storm swept many of the horses overboard as they traveled to Veracruz. When they got to the coastal city, many of the dragoons were forced to fight in the trenches with the infantry. Some of the dragoons were dispatched outside of Veracruz to the village of Medellin. There they met stiff resistance, and the commander, Colonel Harney, sent back for reinforcements. Hardee was in the process of disembarking horses from the transports when the request came. He quickly assembled his dragoons and set off for Medellin, where the Americans pinned down the Mexicans at the bridge, and then with a wild yell that resounded far and near, we rushed toward the bridge in an irregular manner, the men becoming all mingled together. Hardee, with his dragoons and the volunteers headed by Colonel Haskell and Captain Cheatham, rushed upon it with fearless intrepidity. The fortifications opposed no obstacle. It was immediately leaped. The Mexicans retreated, run, broke, vamoosed. The infantry taken to the thick chaparral in every direction. Some were overtaken and killed, and we pushed on in a trot after the main body of lancers. For his service at Medellin, Hardee was promoted to brevet major. Scott's army pushed inland, with the dragoons leading the way, clearing away small pockets of resistance and chasing the fleeing Mexican army at Cerro Gordo. The army regrouped at Puebla before it entered the Valley of Mexico. While the rest of the army fought at the Battle of Churubusco, Company C of the 2nd Dragoons were at the village of St. Augustine. Guerrilla forces descended on the area and began attacking the Americans. Hardee's troops swept the guerrillas from the field, taking between 30 and 40 horses with equipment. For his actions, Hardee was promoted to brevet lieutenant colonel. Lines of communication and supplies were severed, as the American army pushed into Mexico. It was sporadically restored, but jobs that helped Scott's army were efforts like Hardee performed when he went out into the countryside and returned with 1,000 bushels of corn for the army. At the Battle of Molino del Rey, Hardee was cited for his gallantry in battle by Major Edwin Sumner. They all did well, but I must mention in particular the successful efforts of Captain Hardee in maintaining order in his squadron during the many evolutions that it was necessary to make with great rapidity. On September 14, 1847, the dragoons escorted Winfield Scott into Mexico City when the capital capitulated. The dragoons took in the sights and sounds of the city as they began their occupation. Many officers came together to commemorate their time in Mexico and created the Aztec Club. Hardee joined, along with other future prominent commanders, including Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, Cadmus Wilcox, Richard Ewell, John C. Pemberton, Joseph E. Johnston, Robert E. Lee, Ulysses S. Grant, Joseph Hooker, and George McClellan, to name a few. Hardee left Mexico, arriving in New Orleans, Louisiana on February 14, 1848. He proceeded to Savannah, then to St. Augustine to see his wife and children, then to Baltimore on recruitment duty, and finally he spent a few months at the Carlisle Barracks in Pennsylvania training soldiers, before heading back to St. Augustine. There he got to see his newest child, William Joseph Hardee, who had been born while he was on duty in Pennsylvania. His next assignment was on the Texas frontier. He moved his family to their new duty station, putting them up in a home in San Antonio, while he went to Ringgold Barracks on the Rio Grande. For 2 months he was at Ringgold Barracks before going to another fort on the Leona River. Monotony was the order of the day, with the occasional excitement created by small Indian raids. Some were more troublesome than others, though. On at least one occasion, when some Native Americans stole horses from the fort, Hardee ordered the men who pursued the thieves to take no prisoners, wishing they had met 30 instead of just 3. Hardee's mentality toward Indians wasn't uncommon. He expressed the same views as many officers operating on the frontier. In 1849 and 1850, Hardee led large expeditions of around 300 men, including dragoons and Texas Rangers, to rid vast areas of Texas of Native Americans, with the Comanche being a target in a negotiated peace deal in 1850 by Hardee. When Hardee returned from his expedition, Elizabeth had given birth to another child, named Elizabeth after her mother. Hardee's wife soon came down with tuberculosis, and her health declined rapidly. He requested leave to take care of her and move her and the children to St. Augustine to be closer to her family. Hardee remained with her on leave from 1850 until October 1852, when the War Department ordered him to Fort Graham. However, Hardee received word that her condition was becoming even worse. He requested leave again, and it was granted. He returned to Florida, and to accommodate Hardee, the War Department gave him a paymaster position in Florida so he could be with his wife. On June 10, 1853, Elizabeth passed away from her illness. Hardee left the children in the care of their aunt, Anna, and he was called to Washington for special duty. He arrived in the capital in November 1853. There he met with Jefferson Davis, the Secretary of War. The two had known each other since the opening salvos of the Mexican-American War. Hardee's notoriety as being one of the most proficient and promising officers, not to mention he was recognized as one of the foremost in the matters of training soldiers, placed him at the top of the list of officers to help construct a new manual of arms for the light infantry. Jefferson Davis wrote about the need for a new manual, writing, "In anticipation of an increased, if not exclusive, use of rifle arms by the regular army, and because of the belief that the rifle or light infantry system of instruction is best adapted to the foot militia, I have caused inquiries to be instituted into the system used by the light troops of other countries, that complete light infantry or rifle tactics might be introduced into the service. With the recent improvements in small arms, it is probable that the distinction in the armament of heavy and light infantry and riflemen will nearly cease, especially in our service, where the whole force is liable to be employed as light troops." Undoubtedly influenced by the French light infantry tactics developed in their battles in Algeria, Davis and other War Department officials wanted to bring light infantry tactics to the United States, and Hardee seemed like the most logical choice. One of Hardee's commanders, Edwin Sumner, was traveling through Europe studying European military tactics and drill, and possibly recommended Hardee for the position as well. Hardee dove right into the project, first traveling to Harper's Ferry to the Federal Arsenal to examine the new rifles that were going to be issued to the military so he could adjust the tactics accordingly. Then he went to the arsenal in Washington, D.C. to meet with a board of officers. By July 1854, a manuscript for the new manual was complete. Hardee and Davis went to West Point to select cadets to learn the new manual of arms, which Hardee supervised. In October, the cadets were ready to put on a display of what they had learned to the Secretary of War. The manual was quickly adopted and distributed to regular Army units as well as state militia units. At first, soldiers were averse to learning a new system, but they eventually adopted it, and it became so popular that Hardee's name was widely known both in the military and outside of it for his contribution to the United States Army. One of the most significant differences in Hardee's tactics, as opposed to Winfield Scott's tactics, was maneuverability. Hardee stressed flexibility. Deployment of troops wouldn't require any halts, which meant that soldiers could go into battle faster, and the less time they spent deploying meant the less time the enemy had to fire volleys into their ranks. This quick-moving manual of arms and tactics revolutionized the American military and had a large impact on future actions by the men who began to study them in camps, forts, and barracks around the country.